Good afternoon. Welcome to this celebration of the 8th and 9th Annual Stanford Bright Award for Environmental Sustainability. It's so wonderful to finally be here in person and be able to celebrate the 2020 Bright Award winner, Maria Azhunova, and the 2021 Bright Award winner, India Logan-Riley, whose award events we had to postpone due to the pandemic. Also, I'd like to extend a welcome to those of you joining us via live stream as well. I'd like to start by thanking everyone who was involved in making this award and event happen, including the faculty and students who served on the committee to select this evening's honorees. I also want to thank the Bright family, and in particular, Ray's niece Shay. Thank you for advising us on this award and for being here today. Ray Bright was the son of a park ranger and grew up loving the outdoors. His passion for the environment carried on throughout his life as he and his wife Marcelle made frequent visits to natural wonders around the world. A graduate of Stanford Law School's class of 1959, Ray had a successful legal career. He and Marcelle wanted to give back by supporting teaching and research on environmental law and policy and recognizing people around the world engaged in sustainability efforts. In previous years, we've recognized and celebrated environmentalists from 7 different regions around the world. A social entrepreneur from Brazil working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, a conservationist from British Columbia working to save the Great Bear Rainforest and create jobs for coastal First Nations, the director of the Cambridge University Institute for Sustainability Leadership, who's training business leaders in sustainable practices, the chief programs officer of the Northern Rangelands Trust, who's working on conservancy management and community development in Kenya, 2 entrepreneurs developing energy solutions at grassroots level in Ukraine, 2 peace builders working together on water conservation and security in the Middle East, and finally, a climate activist who led multiple efforts to restore and preserve the high mountain regions of Pakistan. I know the 2020 and 2021 award winners are just as worthy of the Bright Award, and to help introduce you to their work, we have a video that I think you will enjoy. The Bright Award is given to individuals all around the world who are dedicating their careers to increasing sustainability and conservation, and it's the highest environmental prize given by Stanford University. Stanford Law alumnus and lifelong conservationist Ray Bright established the Bright Award to bring attention to unsung heroes who are doing important conservation work. The 2 Bright Award winners honored today, Maria Azhunova from Siberia and India Logan-Riley from New Zealand, illustrate the importance of Indigenous leadership in conservation and environmental sustainability efforts. Both Maria and India, with their respective teams, are proving that a successful path forward in the effort to address climate change must incorporate Indigenous rights and knowledge. We hope this award will further assist Maria and India in their ongoing efforts to organize Indigenous youth working for climate change action and Indigenous sovereignty.
The work of the Land of Snow Leopard Network is rooted in Indigenous understanding of the sacredness, cultural, and environmental significance of the snow leopard and its ecosystems. We are a strong network of more than 100 people from 5 regions: Mongolia, Republic of Buryatia in Russian Federation, Republic of Altai, Russian Federation, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan.
Maria has been quite indispensable. It's very difficult to move a network like this forward. For one thing, we're working in 5 different languages, not even to mention the regional ones. The difficulties also include 75 years of Soviet repression, the effects on Indigenous communities of colonization, emotional and psychological effects of colonization.
One of the organisations I belong to, Te Arapatu, is a collective of Māori and Pacific youth working at the intersection between Indigenous sovereignty and climate change. Te Arapatu is a special name for a lot of reasons. For us, very simply, it means the woven path, but it also means so many other things. Also has resonance across languages, and that to us is really important to affirm the relationship of Te Arapatu with the Pacific as a whole, to reconnect Māori and Pacifica as a bigger family. Te Arapatu is really important in the ecosystem of all the organisations out there because its specific mission is to work with Indigenous youth. So part of what we do is organising Indigenous youth delegations to go to the UN climate change negotiations. We work with other Indigenous peoples from around the world to lobby for decisions that respect and uphold Indigenous rights, as well as solidarity actions and coordinating with other Indigenous and frontline communities.
Indigenous people, we are guardians of 80% of the world's biodiversity. If you lose intergenerational transfer of the way of life, of culture, of spirituality and reverence to nature, then we're not only going to lose Indigenous people, but we will lose the entire world.
It is our belief that our young people are infinitely powerful. It's just that the barriers of the system, the colonial system that we live in, denies that power or seeks to oppress it. It's really important to us to continue to support community-led initiatives because those are the ones that are born of the local environment and will be the most effective and are the most authentic to expressions of Indigenous autonomy and sovereignty.
I think India is really deserving of this award because I've noticed that India has a real strong commitment to the issue of climate justice. And for India, it's not just a hobby. It's not a nice thing to do on the side. It's their life, it's their world, it's their whenua, it's their land, it's their water, it is their family, it is their community. And that's why I think this award is fantastic, because it's actually recognising the people who are there to do the work in the long term to make a difference for our planet, for our people.
This award is both honoring Maria's past achievements, but really focusing on her future. And it's going to enable her to concentrate on achieving her full potential as a leader in biological and cultural conservation.
This award is a recognition of Indigenous peoples as guardians of Mother Earth. It's also an acknowledgement of Indigenous values, wisdom, and ways of life, without which the survival of Mother Earth and the entire humanity would not be possible.
What a wonderful video, and so wonderful to see the different landscapes in which this vital conservation work is occurring. So as you know, Maria and India are unparalleled environmental leaders and Indigenous advocates. Maria Azhunova is an Indigenous Buryat conservation leader who harnesses her people's Indigenous knowledge and culture to drive conservation projects in both Eastern Russia and Mongolia. She's executive director of the Baikal Buryat Center for Indigenous Culture and the director of the Land of the Snow Leopard Network. The Land of the Snow Leopard Network has pioneered an innovative approach to conservation, combining Western and Indigenous science and promoting Indigenous perspectives in order to protect the snow leopard and Indigenous communities. Maria helped lead a project to restore livestock native to Buryatia that were almost completely exterminated during the Soviet era. She also worked with a spiritual leader in Buryatia to designate a territory of traditional natural resource use, recognizing the traditional stewardship of the Soyot people. Our 2021 winner, India Logan-Riley, is the co-founder of Tera Watsu, a group of Indigenous youth from the Pacific and New Zealand working for climate action and Indigenous sovereignty. Formed in 2017, Tera Watsu is the first ever Indigenous youth organization to represent their communities at the UN climate talks. There, the group's advocacy highlighted the disproportionate burden of climate change on Indigenous people. The group also contributed to the historic inclusion of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus in direct negotiations at the UN climate talks and fostered the inclusion of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus principles in the UN's decision on an Indigenous Peoples platform. In subsequent UN climate talks, they've continued to influence the negotiation and implementation of the Indigenous Peoples Platform in the Paris Agreement's rulebook. India and Tarawatsu want to support ongoing Indigenous climate leadership through the establishment of an annual Pacific Climate Fellowship. This fellowship would be a place for young people to continue exploring Indigenous understandings of climate justice and gain access to the support and tools needed to be effective climate leaders within their communities. Both Maria and India have been dedicated to empowering their communities to address a future with climate change. For all these reasons, I'm so proud to present the 2020 and 2021 Stanford Bright Award for Environmental Sustainability. If you could please join me on the stage to receive the award. We'll now have an opportunity to hear first from Maria and then from India, and when they finish their remarks, Brooke Thompson, the Robert E. Paradise Professor of Natural Resources Law, the founding director of Stanford Law School's Environmental and Natural Resources Program, the former Perry L. McCarty Director and Senior Fellow of the Woods Institute for the Environment, and the chair of the selection committee for this award, will invite our panelists to the stage and introduce the discussion on Indigenous conservation. I'm delighted to introduce Maria and then India.
My name is Maria Azhunova. I greeted you in my native language, which means peace and well-being to all of you. My people, the Buryat Mongols, are indigenous to the Lake Baikal region, just north of the Russian-Mongolian border. I come from the Ihirit tribe, Bora clan on my father's side, and Sahan Khangodar clan on my mother's. Both clans connect their origin to Lake Baikal, the deepest and the oldest freshwater lake in the world. I would like to officially acknowledge that we're gathered today on the ancestral land of the Ohlone people. I'm grateful to Ohlone people and their ancestors that it is possible to be here together today. I'm very honored and humbled to become a winner of the Stanford Bright Award. But the award is not mine. The award belongs to my elders, members of the World Indigenous Spiritual Practitioners, Baikal Bird Center for Indigenous Cultures, the Land of Snow Leopard Network. The Bright Award is such a significant recognition of the everyday work, aspirations, vision, entire way of living and knowing of my elders from various indigenous communities across Central and Inner Asia. This is a recognition of indigenous approaches to nature conservation. As Norbu Lama, one of the founding members of the Land of Snow Leopard Network, said, and I quote, "Conservation in our understanding and practice is directly related to the revival of traditional spiritual beliefs and practices. Traditions, ceremonies, and customs helps us to keep and sustain sacredness of our land. There is a myriad of spirit lords of nature, and we communicate with them through our ceremonies, restoring fading relationships and creating harmony in the souls of each participant. These invaluable teachings are given to us by our ancestors. The reciprocity of local communities' relationships with their environment determines the quality of life on their landscape." End of quote. We sincerely believe that the survival of humanity and the future of our planet depends on the degree to which Altan Hilhi, the golden interweave, human, nature, culture, is honored and passed from generation to generation in a truly authentic way. The Bright Award raised the profile of our work and is helping now to amplify our voices and solutions. Our Network and Elders Council, in its unity, will continue working to fulfill their obligations to humanity and nature to restore and spread their original meanings and values that are lost by many, but are still alive on Indigenous people's lands and waters. I'm very happy and very grateful. But my heart hurts when I think about the war that every day takes away the lives of soldiers and ordinary people. My mind can't comprehend how this tragedy became possible. Dehumanization reached an enormous scale. One of our elders, Ustot Daler from Pamir Mountains, said, I quote, "Today's crisis is an indicator of the unhealed relationships among humans. Indeed, everything that is happening around us are things that we carry ourselves internally. That is why any opportunity to get closer to each other and to find concord is an occasion of mutual healing. Because to accept someone else, to understand him, to think of him as being yourself only in a different expression is the meaning of integral unity. And the real essence of nature is integral wholeness." I'm asking you to accept these words of my elder. This is an appeal for harmonization, an appeal to harmonize our inner worlds. And with that, to connect to the outer world in oneness and universal harmony. Thank you very much. Bairtla, bairte.
I kind of feel a bit too short for this podium. Kia ora koutou katoa, huri hou no ngā takangunu rangitane rongo mai wahine, ko India Logan-Riley, I hope. My name is India. I'm from a place called Te Matua Maui. It's colonially known as Hawke's Bay. Te Matua Maui translates to the Hook of Maui, which references the event in which Maui, who I'm sure many of you know from the movie Moana, fished up the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And where I'm from is where the hook sank into the side of the fish and pulled it up. And for me, that is a story that captures within it the relationship that my community and the communities around Aotearoa have to the Pacific. And the Pacific is one of those incredible places. When we talk about our creation story, we talk about Ranginui and Papatūānuku, or I guess roughly and crudely translating to Sky Father and Mother Earth, being entwined together, they are clasped together, hugging really tight, and their children were born in the darkness between. Until one day, some of their children got really fed up about being stuck in that darkness and decided, nah, we've had enough. We're gonna break this open. We're gonna crack mum and dad apart. Of course, some of the children were really upset by this idea. Some of the children thought, oh, I don't really know what I want. But in the end, Tani Mahuta, who had gone to become the god of the forest, broke their parents apart. And with that was born the world of light, the world that we know today. But because of that, Ranginui, or Sky Father, found it so upsetting that he cried for days, and he filled the crevices of Papatūānuku with water, right? The rivers, the streams, the oceans that we have. And so the Pacific Ocean is this really clear embodiment of the love that everything has for the world around us. There's the love that Ranginui has for Papatūānuku, and he continues to nourish that love through his tears, even now here, a little bit today. And so for me, that's really what this work comes from is a love for these people and places, even people and places who I haven't met, people and places that I've only met or encountered now. And so that's what I guess motivates me in my work and what motivates my peers in this work. I can't talk about this without talking about an uncle of mine that passed away 2 weeks ago now, who I only knew as an uncle, and up until I was about 20 years old and I went to university and I found out how amazing he was, and I was reading writings written by him and I was like, why didn't Mum introduce me and get us to be friends? And this uncle's name was Moana Jackson. And he was the chair of the group that wrote the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He was a judge on international tribunals on Indigenous rights. A really incredible man who, to me, again, was just an uncle, a very humble man, a very generous man who always made time for all of us. And I think of him a lot because I think about so many of my heroes back home, so many of our elders and my peers and my friends whose names may never be in rooms like this, but who do the incredible work to keep our communities going back home, who do the planting and the conservation work, who do the cooking of the food to redistribute to communities during natural disasters and wildfires and earthquakes and even man-made disasters. So during COVID, it was our communities that came together and supported each other and keep each other alive for generations and generations. And they always played humble. And so it's really awkward for me to be up here today, like, I'm going to do a speech about this award when, really, much like Uncle Moana, this is not the kind of thing that we would willingly do. But I guess that's the nature of the work, is we just have to do it anyway. And I'm reminded of a quote by a friend of mine, Kahukutia, who was actually on our second delegation. She's in many of these photos. And she says, I will live and die 1,000 times and still be of this land. And that to me really speaks to that connection of my community, that in the face of climate change, in the face of a few hundred years of intense colonial harm, that we will continue to be of this land even after we pass and come back again and again and again. And so I guess I just want to wind this up by saying thank you to my team in Te Arawhatu. To that first delegation, we had no idea what we were doing or getting ourselves into, but we decided as a bunch of young people that this is what we were going to chase. And then coming home and being able to share that with our communities has been really meaningful. And so I don't want to, I guess, diminish the pride that my community sees in having me be here today and receive this award, but also know that there's so many of those humble uncles and aunties and cousins back home who as equally deserve to be here. And I think about the challenges as we're going forward, some of those challenges that my community is already dealing with, that we're going to be talking about in this room, and the difficulties of traveling far away to then come back home and spread the message and share the word and try and connect as people and then spread back out again. And of course, in this, I will return back to the words of Uncle Moana in one of his last emails to me, which was to travel safely and to stay brave. And that's essentially the work, is to stay brave in really uncomfortable times. And I know even today in this room, as we have this panel, we might have some uncomfortable conversations, talk about some challenging facts and historical events, but really, and following the legacy of Uncle Moana, that it is to stay brave in the face of that, because otherwise we will keep coming back here time and time again in honour of those lands and territories that we come from. So yeah, thank you all so much for giving me your time to listen to me ramble on. Of course, such an honour to be here alongside Maria as well. To all of you who are here in the room, giving up your time here today, thank you. And yeah, I hope we get to talk more later on as well. Kia ora.
So again, my name is Brook Thompson, and I had the privilege of chairing the committees that chose the two Bright Award winners that we are honoring this evening. And Maria and India, I want to congratulate you again. As we all know, the world is an incredibly depressing place at the moment. And so we're blessed to have your spirit of healing, your spirit of optimism, your spirit of warmth join us this evening. So it's not only my pleasure in being able to chair the committee, and I should just mention, by the way, that the committees generally review hundreds of applicants, hundreds of nominees for this particular award. And so the fact that Maria and India have won it this evening really says a lot about what they have been able to accomplish during their lives. The second thing I get to do, as I said, is to actually announce the panel this evening. So the panel is going to be on Indigenous conservation. And as both of the two award winners have pointed out already, we really are going to need Indigenous communities to help us to get out of the predicament that we're in today, the environmental predicament, the unsustainability of our world today. We really need the Indigenous communities not only to help us lead the way, but also because they know the way that we need to head. So we have two other members of the panel, and I want to invite them up. The first person I want to invite up is Brooke Thompson. Brooke is somebody who I've been blessed to hear before here at Stanford. Brooke is one of our young Indigenous leaders here in California. Brooke is a member of the Yurok Nation. She is also a graduate student here in civil and environmental engineering. She's been an intern at the U.S. Senate, the California Water Resources Control Board, the City of Portland, and she's won a whole variety of awards for both her work and for her studies. And then our moderator this evening is Greg Dalton. We keep inviting Greg back every year because he is the best moderator in the world. Greg is the founder and has run the Climate One program since 2007. And I think it's particularly appropriate that what led Greg to actually start Climate One was a trip that he took to Russia with climate experts and journalists to talk about the problems of climate change and what was going to be necessary to solve them. And Greg came back from that particular trip and said, okay, he's going to start Climate One, which to this day is the only talk show. That's sort of amazing to me, but the only regular talk show that brings together governmental, NGO, business leaders to talk about how we're going to address climate change and create a sustainable society. So with that, I'll hand things over to Greg.
Thank you, Buzz. That's a delight to be here again. Isn't it wonderful to be here in person again after this? And congratulations to our winners. India, you mentioned that going to the Conference of Parties, the climate summit, and that was the seed. And so you've kind of told that a little bit. And I'm curious, there's some power structures underneath there about how Indigenous people, sovereign nations, are not recognized at the United Nations. So talk about some of the power dynamics there and what you have to do to get in there. There's some really interesting backstories and how that there's power structures underneath that keep people like you out.
Yeah, the UN is a complicated mutant kraken of a beast. So lots of different parts to it. I guess, the UN climate talks happens every year. They've been running since before I was born, which is really daunting to think about because emissions still aren't coming down. But I guess, so there's lots of different ways that you can get into these conferences. You can go as a government negotiator, or you can go as a person from the media, or you can go as a person from civil society to lobby these countries to make better decisions. Kind of acting as the moral compass and the conscience of those negotiations. At the same time, you also have fossil fuel executives who go to lobby for looser decisions and weaker decisions and stuff like that. So it's like a microcosm of what's happening globally around climate change. And so it's a really hard process to get in. You need like a special little badge with a barcode on it that's scanned as you go in and scanned as you leave with your face on it, so they always know who's in the building at all times. And to get one of those badges, you have to be allocated a badge from an accredited organization. And you have to apply for those badges sometimes 6 months in advance. To be an accredited organization, you have to have been around for a while, and then you've got to do the paperwork, and then the UN has to process it, and the UN does not process paperwork quickly. And so it's a massive journey to even get access to those badges. So they're kind of more valuable than gold to get in there. We as Indigenous communities or as sovereign nations do not have an automatic right to be in there, even though we are nations as well. If we're talking about the United Nations, it's the United Colonial Nations plus ones that they let in, rather than united all the nations that exist. And so the UN wouldn't be able to badge us without contradicting its guarantee to these colonial nations that it would respect its colonial nation sovereignty. And so it kind of cements these global colonial relationships and the oppression of Indigenous peoples by not guaranteeing us a seat at the table or even to be in the negotiations. You're not allowed to just protest as you like. You have to apply 24 hours in advance to have a protest in the venue, and it has to be in one of 3 pre-allocated zones. If you do an unorganized or unsanctioned action, you can be kicked out from that conference, your delegation will be kicked out, your organization will be kicked out, you may be banned for 5 years, your organization may be banned for 5 years. So if you're going to choose to throw down in a big action, you do it with a lot of people so that the UN looks bad, kicking all of civil society out. It eventually happens like every year towards the end of negotiations, there'll be a big action. But if you do it as a small group of Indigenous peoples, that's it, you're out. You're not allowed to go into negotiating rooms unless you're a government negotiator for a lot of them. And so with the Marrakesh climate talks in 2016 with the Indigenous Peoples Platform, we found out that they were going to have a negotiation about what it would look like, this Indigenous space, without even inviting us in. And so we found out 5 minutes before the meeting was happening. I remember people running down the hallway to find out where the meeting room was, going in there even though we could have been kicked out for 5 years. And then thankfully Bolivia let us take their speaking slot. And so even then when our stuff was being negotiated about us, we weren't included. And so it just continues to be a barrier. And of course it's not funded to go, we fundraise every year to go. And then it's about educating our young people to be able to know what to do in that space as well, which can take several years because it's that beast, complicated beast of a space. And so yeah, it's the badges, it's the money, it's the education to be able to make the most of the space. And it's really exciting to see more Indigenous peoples come through and for us to be able to connect. Like even today I met up with a couple of friends who came along to the earlier talk who'd been at the UN climate talks and that I'd met there, and so we build these relationships, which are really important, but it's an eternally difficult place until our sovereignty is acknowledged in those spaces.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it seems kind of obvious, but till you look at it, they have Indigenous nations excluded from there. Maria, you've followed your parents. Something that's really touching in leading the Buryat Center. I'm curious to see how you see those UN structures. Are they even relevant to, so much is focused on global climate change and global biodiversity in these international structures. Do you see them as a place you desire to be, or are they even relevant to your work you're doing in the Baikal region?
Well, for starters, at the end of the day, UN is a sentient being, right? It consists of many sentient beings, and in our understanding, like all life is sacred, all sentient beings are important, and yet it's also a very complicated space and place, as India shared, and as we know. But I can't remember for certain, but I believe it was in 2018 where my organization and Ayun Batat, we were present at the special session, the UN's
Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples Issues. We presented our work on revival of Aboriginal breed livestock. You know, complicated, difficult, but we have to persevere. And one of the things that we discussed earlier today with Stanford students is that, you know, the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights is written in blood of Indigenous people and blood of our ancestors. And so much sacrifice went to every single comma, every single letter. So, you know, we have to be there. We have to persevere. No matter the difficulties, the bureaucracy, and you know, we just have to persevere. And in terms of, you know, efficiency or not efficiency, this is a very large space. And just a lot of people died, you know, for us to live. And, you know, we just have to persevere and continue this dialogue. And as long as we see each other on a human level, as equal, as a continuation of ourselves, then only that way we can move forward and the system itself will change.
Thank you for that. I'm still absorbing the UN as a sentient being and all life being sacred. I'm gonna think about that one for quite a while. Thank you for that. Not the way that a lot of Americans typically think about the UN, which is why this is so exciting. Brooke, I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself in your language as Maria and India have done.
Thank you. Ayakui Nicknau Brooke Thompson, me work my Stanford Oak, Puracalawe, Este Pichacalawe, Ne Pichuas Iwak Archie Thompson. So my name is Brooke Thompson. I'm Yurok and Karuk from the Klamath River of Northern California. My grandfather is Archie Thompson, rest in peace. And I'm currently at Stanford.
And when you were 7 years old, you went out on the riverbanks where your ancestors have lived for, you said what, 12,000 years?
More than 12,000 years, yeah.
And you saw something horrific that really shaped your life. Tell us what you saw there.
Yeah, so one of my defining experiences and kind of realizing my indigeneity extends outside of my reservation is when I was 7 years old and the day after one of our healing ceremonies in my tribe, where it was after a night of laughter, of praying, of healing, of good food, of family. I walked out early in the morning on the Klamath River on the rocky shore, surrounded by the early morning fog, the towering redwood trees, and the surrounding mountains, holding my warm mother's hand as we walked out with my father and saw thousands of dead salmon lying on the banks of the river. And for me, that wasn't just the death of a food source that is just yummy and maybe a little bit expensive for some people, but for me, that was the death of the connection I had to my ancestors. My ancestors, having lived in the same place in Northern California for that many years, they specifically took care of the salmon with me in mind generations ago. It's the youth of these salmon that their grandparents knew my grandparents, and they had a relationship of management with each other. They took care of each other in order to take care of me, and so I could take care of them as well. And I felt like I failed being a 7-year-old protecting these salmon. And to know that this was gonna be an experience that changed my entire life from then on out, because even youth who have not seen what I saw that day of the dead, rotting salmon on the shorelines, that happened seemed like overnight. These salmon were alive the night before, but bad policy decisions and bad decisions in a drought year, decisions made outside my reservation, affected me as a downriver person. The word Yurok, my tribal name, literally translates to downriver people. And for me to see that, I realized that I need to leave the reservation at some point to make these decisions, because this would have never happened if my tribal people were in charge and we had more of a say in what was going on here. And I saw the repercussions of that fold out through many years, where diabetes, heart rate went up, obesity rates went up from not having food sources and being in a food desert where it took a half a day to a day to get food. And seeing literal people die from these diseases, to having a mental health crisis where suicide was at an alarming rate. And part of this, I believe, being from not being able to spend that time on the river with my family. I fished with my grandfather and my father and my cousins, who told me stories of our tribe, who were there to teach me techniques and share our history. But now people have to go outside for economic income, leaving their families behind, leaving that family time. And then we don't have the salmon for ceremony, and so our mental health declines. So our community, our spiritual, our physical well-being, our mental well-being is tied to the water quality and tied to these salmon. And I don't think people realize how devastating that was for us when that went away. And I've been fighting with my tribal members ever since then to make sure we never have to see that happen again. And yet it's a yearly struggle for us and a yearly concern.
Thank you for sharing that. Maria, you mentioned the golden interweave, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that and how that is challenged by the declining in biodiversity and environmental pressures that we're seeing. You meant that interweave, and I think India also used that word as well.
So the term Altan-Hilhi comes from Mongolia, the golden interweave, human, nature, culture. And in Indigenous worldview, everything is so interdependent. Nature is part of us, we're part of nature, culture is part of us, culture is part of nature, and overall it creates oneness, right? This wholeness. When we see this crisis today, and as one of the elders from Pamir Mountains, Taler Achai said, it's because on human level, we're losing relationships with ourselves is declining, and therefore the relationships with nature, with Mother Earth is also declining. So because they're linked. With the loss of biodiversity, I think one of the prime reasons is the loss of traditional understanding that, frankly, all cultures have and had and have. That nature is important. We're part of nature, and because this understanding is degraded, that's how this interweave is challenged. Is being attacked. But there's hope. We're still here. Indigenous people are still here. I think it's safe to say we're no longer asking, to have a seat at the table. We are leading the table. We are leading this movements, and the sooner, everybody else joins us and accepts our leadership, and together we will be able to strengthen the golden interweave of the nature, human culture. So both of my organizations, but the Land of Snow Leopard Network specifically, we focus on blending traditional indigenous knowledge and Western conservation science practices in order not to only save snow leopards and its ecosystems, but also to preserve the cultural and spiritual integrity of the indigenous and local communities of this very, very vast regions where we work. So I think it's safe to say that we're doing our part tirelessly in strengthening this golden interweave. But we're also asking, and we're inviting big Western education institutions to join us,
to continue to make Indigenous knowledge prestigious, for the lack of a better word. Because if, for instance, for places like Stanford or Harvard, to establish something like Department of Traditional Indigenous Knowledge, where my elders, Indigenous cultural practitioners, can teach both, Stanford students and specifically Indigenous youth. And we know there's such a big problem of Indigenous youth, losing their ways and connections to the ancestral heritage and leaving to bigger cities and urban environments. There's a way to kind of reverse that, and by having the space for Indigenous knowledge to be raised on such a profile, such as Western science, then that is a very, I think, very valid and quite simple solution to a lot of issues that we face today.
Thank you for sharing that. I was thinking as I'm preparing for this about, there's the, at E.O. Wilson has a half Earth idea, and like that kicked off all sorts of policy ideas that are now 30 by 30. And here's a white guy at Harvard who comes up with an idea that gets a lot of traction that is like been done for centuries by your cultures. And it's like, oh, but if the white guy at Harvard comes up with it, it gets traction. It's something that I just wanted to reflect on that. India, much of Western thinking and conservation on climate is grounded in science. Science is, a lot of it is about isolating and separating variables to determine causality. That's very different than the interweave that Maria just mentioned. So how do you relate to Western science?
Well, actually, my academic background's in archaeology, so I do a bit of the science. But I think really, and for those who are there with the students today, I talked about this, which was, I guess like a Māori approach to knowledge development is based on relationality. And so we have this word whakapapa, which means to kind of make papa, or to make beneath you, but it sometimes is crudely translated to mean like ancestry or genealogy, but it's an acknowledgement of the way in which relationships come together to create phenomenon, whether that be environment cycles around us or descendants. And so any point in time, any person is both a receiver of whakapapa and a creator of it. And so it's this like infinite loop. And I think when it comes to thinking about things like science and the relationship between, say, Māori knowledge and Western science, is looking back into what was the whakapapa of that, what was the relationships that came before that affected that relationship and how it exists today. And of course, like I know this from archaeology, is that the relationship between science and Indigenous peoples is really fraught, and it's full of a lot of pain. The ways in which my people were categorized into being subhuman, and that was used to justify the theft of our lands and the oppression and the criminalization of our practices. And so I think we can't really talk about the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and science without acknowledging the harm occurred, and then that needs to be repaired, because we can't just ignore the legacy of Western science and what it has done to communities like mine, like really, really harmful intergenerational violence. Like even the collecting of our people's bones to put in museums and stuff like that is just like disgusting, really. And having to fight to get those back. And like, so even at like Oxford University, which is one of the most prestigious in the world, a piece of my ancestral house sits in that museum. A piece of it sits in the British Museum. It was traded in bits. So the pieces of my ancestors and our stories have been carried all over the world without our consent, and they still haven't come home. And so part of when we're talking about our relationship with science is we also need to talk about the ways in which science can then help heal that harm. And it's interesting to talk about Indigenous faculties and universities when particularly like a lot of those universities are built on Indigenous land, which is still trying to fight to get that land returned. And I'm thinking particularly of back home, where a lot of our Indigenous professors are having to leave universities because of their experiences of racism. And luckily we have a couple of Māori universities, and that's a good time, so they can shift. But it's hard then, because
for those of us who are Indigenous youth who are going to these universities to study, we don't necessarily have the same access to safe spaces and to learn our practices because our older people are having to leave because of the toughness of those institutions. And so I think we can't really talk about a lot of solutions, or we can talk about solutions, but that has to go hand in hand with an honesty about the things that need to be fixed and resolved, and the ways in which science has done harm in the past. And also, like, I love archaeology, so it's hard, it's difficult, but that's like, you know, what Uncle Moana said, like, we've got to dive into that and we can't just ignore it. And I do like the idea of, you know, Indigenous knowledge holders being resourced to do this work. So often we're approached by researchers to just like convey that knowledge, and then like it's taken and the research is gone, and then we get nothing in return. And so yeah, that really has to be compensated, like any kind of technological advisor or scientist or anything like that. Yeah.
And Brooke, you've also tried to bridge that between science and Indigenous knowledge, and particularly at the tell us about how you encountered that regarding spring salmon and the Endangered Species Act. You tried to bridge that Western science and Indigenous knowledge.
So first off, I wanted to say thank you so much for what you said, and then also your uncle who helped write the declaration. I used to keep that on my wall every single morning. I'd wake up and read it. And I was also recently invited as a delegate this last year to go to the UN as well, and I hope to go next year, and I hope to see you there and so be cheering for you in the background. But the incident that you're talking about happened recently, where the spring salmon in the Chinook spring salmon in the Klamath River were trying to have a decision if they were similar enough to be considered the same as the fall salmon. And this was a decision under the California Fish and Game Commission. So I was contacted about this because no one was going to these meetings. And so I helped along with Save California Salmon, rally people to comment at this hearing where they were making the decision that day. And for me, this was an important issue because in the Yurok and Karuk languages, which I speak Karuk-Ishish, but in the languages, the spring and fall salmon have specific different words and distinct words, and we eat these salmon so much. Traditionally, we eat about 450 pounds of salmon per person per year. And even now, that's down to close to 5 or 2 pounds per person per year because of the decline in salmon. We know that they taste different, they act different, that we consider them different fish, when a lot of other species of fish we group in one word or in one category. But this distinction is important to us. And so we had people who were from the tribes make these comments that was backing up recent genetic research that were showing that they cannot evolve from one another. And they eventually did make the decision to cover the spring salmon because of that genetic research that came out under the California Endangered Species Act, since they're considered a different species now. But they told us during their decision-making process that they aren't allowed to take into consideration traditional ecological knowledge into the decision-making process. And for me, that was very invalidating, saying that, our knowledge is not real, like quote unquote, real scientific knowledge. And despite that being passed, that's kind of what's influenced me to go on and and try to pursue a PhD at UCSC coming up this fall here in environmental studies.
You're not going to try, you're going to do it.
Gonna do it. And I'm hoping to look at the integration into traditional ecological knowledge into California water policy. But I've came across a lot of the same struggles that you have, even picking the schools where UC Berkeley has California Indian bones in their universities and their archaeology programs. And I didn't feel comfortable going to a school that had that, and that was one of my decisions to come to Stanford instead. But then even here at Stanford, I've seen posters in the engineering building talking about cultural burns, which is something my tribe's done for thousands of years. And when I was reading this poster in the lobby, it had no mention of the tribes that this concept came from that are now being researched more in depth. And so for me to be at this university and choose to come here and then feel like I'm disregarded through a simple act of not being mentioned in a poster and feeling like I wasn't valuable enough, that our knowledge wasn't valuable enough to mention us in the few hundred words they get in the poster, makes me feel kind of uncomfortable being in academia, honestly, where this knowledge is coming from us, but it feels like it's not being respected.
Appropriated.
Yeah.
Maria, a few years ago, Buzz mentioned that I went to the Arctic, and I've been up there a number of times and met with indigenous cultures in in Siberia, and also this was actually in Nunavut in the Canadian province inhabited by indigenous people. And she talked about many people walking on ice. Everyone up there knows someone who has walked on the ice and died because the ice is changing. Ice that people have walked on for generations and centuries is now because of global warming. And she was really upset because she didn't know what knowledge to pass on. Looking at the sky and the patterns, that's all changing, and it's disrupting the wisdom passed on orally from generation to generation. I'm wondering how the changes that you're seeing is disrupting the oral knowledge passed down from generation to generation, because what's happened in the past is different now. Or if you've even encountered that.
One of the Kyrgyz elders that we work with, Sultakata, he said that no matter what century or millennium, our ancestors always persevered, through all certain crises. Like you look at the human history, there's always been pandemics, there's also been wars, conflicts, changes in natural phenomena. So
it's not really new in some way.
It's not new. At the end of the day, it's not new. But today we have probably this unprecedented opportunity to communicate better, to bring our knowledge systems together, and what else? Yes, environment changed significantly, in the last decades and so forth. And yet again, I would like to talk about, the importance of spirituality and the spiritual traditions. So by restoring those and practicing those, the answer can be found either on a personal level, community level, national level. And for us, when it comes to saving snow leopards and its ecosystems, by knowing that snow leopard is still out there in the mountains, that ensures the ecological integrity of the mountain ecosystems. And I mean, all ecosystems are important, but mountains are very, very significant. So, and we strongly believe that, and as our practice shows, that by practicing and championing the traditional values, traditional indigenous values and traditional indigenous spirituality, it helps snow leopards to survive, because in our worldview, in the communities where we work, snow leopards are considered as a sacred animal, sacred totemic animal. So there's certain taboos associated on how to behave around snow leopards and its food chains. So as long as we practice this type of values, therefore, there's a chance of survival. Because again, to repeat myself, it's not to excuse of what as we humans did and are doing to the planet, but at the end of the day, as humans, we're always facing some sort of crises, and it's just one of them.
There's actually a critique of eco-anxiety, that's actually a very white-centric idea, because I've talked to Indigenous and Black people who say we've been facing these kinds of existential threats for centuries, and you white people are just waking up to it. It's the first time you've experienced it. This is not new to us.
Right. And if I may just add, I and this is like my personal opinion, I know, just to kind of put it out there, if you, for people of Caucasian ancestry and heritage, I think you should stop blaming yourself. At the end of the day, if you want to move forward, you have to have some room for self-forgiveness, forgiveness of your ancestors, and however your relationship with your ancestors may or may not be, it can be complex, it can be not complex, but it's holding you back. You have to move forward, and to be, on the same page as Indigenous, as Indigenous communities, you have to restore, your relationships with your ancestors, because you yourself, right now, your ancestors to the future generations, or your ancestors in making. And once you realize this, there will be no room for this anxiety, like self-beating, that is not productive.
Everybody feel that and get that? Yeah. Thank you. That's quite powerful. India, we heard Maria begin with a land acknowledgement, which has become quite common, and yet can also be a little delicate or fraught. It can be kind of like a little bit of a performative, I'm cool, politically correct. So for those who want to do that with intention, could you give us some guidance about when and how? Because that's happened fairly commonly these days. And sometimes, so pro tips on land acknowledgements.
I mean, I'm not going to say what all Indigenous peoples expect of
Sure,
their
fair.
settlers, but I will say back home we had this framework where we signed a treaty with the British Crown in 1840, which gave permission to the Crown to govern their peoples in Aotearoa, so in New Zealand. And it enshrined the right of Māori to self-govern and to have self-determination and to protect our lands and our treasures and all things that are valuable to us. And then there's some other articles to it as well. But those kind of the two big main pieces. And so when I think about land acknowledgements and kind of more broadly relationships with local Indigenous communities, for me back home it's informed by the treaty structure. And so it's that local nations are self-determining, and if you want to do a land acknowledgement, fine, that's step one to knowing whose stolen lands you're on, but what is that followed up with? What meaningful action is that followed up with? Because there's a lot of trends, even in conservation and in climate space and in wanting to, honor Indigenous knowledge and learn Indigenous knowledge, even that it's about let's say this is special and let's include it in the already existing research agenda or government project agenda or something like that. But it never really gets to the heart of what we're talking about when we talk about the harms that are occurring in climate change and Indigenous peoples facing challenges to leading on climate action, which is about distribution of power and the way that power is structured. And so we can say land acknowledgements, and that's fine, in my opinion, or it's what we would say mihi to the mana whenua, so to kind of give honouring to the people of that particular land. But unless that's also followed through with a redistribution of power and being a part of agitating for that, then it is just, it's tokenistic, and again, it's the surface level, but it is that still a subsuming to a different agenda that we never chose. I don't know, Brooke, do you have thoughts?
Are you going to put me on the spot? I mean, my understanding of land acknowledgements is that I get asked to do them quite often for organizations, but for me personally, again, in my own opinion, can't talk on for anyone but myself,
Sure.
but
Yep.
that it really needs to be the white folks in the room and those who are organizing it that needs to give the land acknowledgments. And it might be a bit messy, but there's many places online where land acknowledgments for your area will already have been written. And especially not using past terms when talking about Indigenous people, acknowledging that we're still here, not where we were originally. And then also, if you're going to give a land acknowledgement, which I think most people should, even in the classrooms, that the next step needs to be real action. And how, because for example, in my language, just very briefly, there's no word for sorry, for example. You can't just apologize because that word does not exist. Instead, we expect either payment or through action to show what sorry is, or the equivalent of sorry in English. And so for me, having a land acknowledgement is kind of like saying sorry in a sense, in that, trying to recognize whose land we're on. But also, I think that needs to be followed up with that action you were talking about, and making sure that there's something that goes along with just the words. And no matter what level of organization you are, there's always something you can do to bring Indigenous people into that conversation.
I started one, and because I thought I feel guilty. I should acknowledge, right? And then someone said, well, I started acknowledging the Ohlone and Miwok people at the beginning of my radio shows and live streams, and then someone said, well, have you spoken to any Ohlone or Miwok people about whether they want you to do that, or you just presume that you're supposed to do that? And I was like, oh, good point. So I wrote an email to a person and established a relationship. And now, Brooke, I think I need to take the next step. Since we're at the law school, before we go to audience questions, Brooke, beneficial use is a foundational concept in water law. How is that white-centric?
This is honestly such a hard question. Bess is laughing.
Very careful how you answer.
Oh, no, yeah. It's definitely not going to affect my future in any way. So for me, I guess just as a student coming into a place where I'm learning about water law and water infrastructure, as a person, coming from a reservation and coming from that tribal setting where I'm just learning about it, when I initially heard about beneficial use and how water is decided where it goes to who and what priority, it seemed it seemed like it didn't make sense to me initially coming in that, beneficial use is basically you get priority water rights, and this is a very, very basic form, but you get priority water rights depending on if you're using the water for beneficial uses, which has a definition in the list where it's a lot of it's agriculture, for example, and who's been using it for the most time. And for me, just hearing the very basic definition, being a student, I'm like, oh yes, it should be the Native Americans who have the priority to the water because we've been using it for thousands of years. And, there's even been examples of other tribes who've used it for farming purposes and agriculture, and yet their water sources have still been cut off and redirected for different reasonings. And especially in times of war, which is something I'd like us to think about now, because even wars that aren't on our soil affect us. For example, with the oil extraction, Keystone XL is being started up again in the US. The tar sand productions, which are in Canada, in fact, the First Nations Indigenous people, are ramping up because of the lack of dependency on Russian oil now, which is going to literally affect and increase Indigenous women murders in the US and Canada. And so even though this war is across seas, it will have real world implications here for our Indigenous people that will not be seen by most. But yeah, for me, the idea of being on this land, having someone else come up with the rules and telling you how to play and telling me how I fit in there, and pretty much the rules being made did not fit my understanding and my tribe's understanding of the world and how we use the water, and then now being told that we have to try to figure out how we fit in this somehow seems very hypocritical to me on the outside. And there's a lot being done, for example, like the water board right now, where they're having what they call tribal beneficial uses, and we're starting to get into the conversation again. But for me, it's like, why were we not in the conversation in the first place? And I'm very thankful for the progress we're making now. but at the same time, it still feels like progress, maybe this is just me being young and antsy, but not being made fast enough and not being widely advertised enough, because I don't even think many of my tribal members and other tribes in California really understand the new policies being put in by the Water Board and what that actually means and how to utilize them. Because a lot of us aren't in these conversations or aren't in these spheres, and so sometimes these decisions are being made without us still. And I just think a lot of Indigenous people need to be put at all levels of government, all levels of community organization, and just all levels of livelihood. We need Indigenous leadership, and especially, young and Indigenous women leadership at the forefront, because there's no climate change, reasonable climate change without climate justice, and there's no climate justice without Indigenous women leadership at the forefront.
There you go. Yeah, Deb, think about Deb Holland for that. We have some time for your questions, if you'd like to identify yourself. We don't have microphones, so if you can state your question, I will repeat it so people can hopefully hear it as well. So questions from the audience for threes. I'm humbled to be up here. This is really, really amazing. Sure.
I have a question regarding direct action and civil disobedience, and I'm curious what role you think that will have in climate change mitigation, the redistribution of power towards Indigenous leaders, and what role white allies and accomplices can have in this.
So the question's about civil disobedience, direct action regarding climate change, and what white allies can do to support you.
Go ahead. I do believe in civil disobedience, for sure. Looking back at history, it definitely, change can't happen without it. Although, it does really depend on the political context at the time. I know we've had issues in the last few years with allied organizations doing things in the name of Indigenous solidarity that wasn't actually, approved or condoned by the Indigenous nation who are dealing with the struggle. I don't want to throw names in the mud, so I'm just gonna leave it at that. It's complicated, and I really do think it comes back down to relationship. We're really lucky back home that we have some collectives of allies who do really incredible things. I will say that we've had better experiences with people of color, with refugees and migrant solidarity organizations, than with the not ones of those categories. It really just comes down to, I guess, listening and learning first and foremost, like learning the histories and the stories, so that when it comes into rooms where we might be having discussions about wanting to do collective actions or wanting to have a network of actions and solidarity actions, that we don't have to educate to begin with, that we can kind of skip over that because the learning has already been done by those who want to be allies who are coming into the room. Like, Google is your friend, and so please ask Google before asking an Indigenous person, but check your sources as well. And I will say, trip-ups will happen, and I say to our young people back home, particularly our young people back home who want to be really good allies, that they get so stressed. Like, it's almost like this shaking chihuahua, just like they know that solidarity has to happen and the treaty has to be honored and everything has to be done right, and they're just freaking out about how to get it right. And I love their passion for it, these school-age kids who just want to do the absolute best. And what I've found has been really great is just basically taking on feedback and not getting caught up in the shame. And that, action is reparations and apologies rather than just saying I'm sorry, because that means then that particularly with our young people that I've been working with, I've seen them pivot and take on feedback and become even greater and more powerful in their solidarity in the last year, that I've seen some of the big old international NGOs in New Zealand move in the last 10 years. And so these long-running NGOs will get stuck in ways of being and stuck in saying sorry rather than just take the feedback on and move. And I know there are so many resources out there that I can't name on the spot right now because I'm drawing a blank. But the information is out there. It just takes a lot of time. And I will say we will have our own projects back home that we're struggling with, like even if it's like a community working, be it our local community garden or something like that. It's like just show up to that and like do the work. Show you can do the work before coming up with the ideas that like then we get invited into, and we're like, oh, but we didn't actually come up with this idea and it's not that great, and now you're so far down the track that you feel bad if you like throw it out the window. So yeah, it just takes time and listening and learning and being willing to take on that feedback. And I will say for organizations that Te Ara Whātua has worked with in the past, we ask that there are people who've done the upskilling and decolonization and solidarity within those organizations that we might choose to work with, so that when hard feelings come up, because they will come up, that there's a network of support for those people who are having hard feelings come up in those white organizations, who can then handle that rather than us being the counselors as well. Because we've got I want my time to be for my young people, for our young people from our community, for our elders and for our practices, rather than spending a lot of time helping those organizations when they could just have some nice, like what we would call like older siblings in those organizations to like help them work through those hard feelings.
Yeah, that's a burden to put that on you. Help us with our guilt or our problem. It's anyone else on that question, or should we go to the next one?
I could very briefly. I'm going to let people interpret this how they want, but when this is a story that I learned when I went to the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and I was told in my Māori Worldview class about this group of white engineers at the university. Yeah, add on to it because it's been a while since I heard this story. But a group of white engineers at the university who used to have this party each year where they dressed up as stereotypical Māori people and Pacifica people, and wrote slurs on themselves, wore fake grass skirts, and jumped on tables and did the most offensive stuff imaginable. And this was a yearly thing, and a group of Māori students wrote letters to the university saying they don't like this, and the university would be like, okay, we'll do something about it. Never hears back. They try to do every logical aspect of what they think should be the right way and the diplomatic way to resolve this issue, and then they decide they're going to go and then just talk to this group of people face to face. And mind you, even I think one of the women there were pregnant, and so they're not looking to be disobedient. They're looking to have a conversation. They come down the stairs to this group of disrespectful white engineering men, and they looking to have a conversation, and one of them spits in the other's face and swings a punch. And so, the Māori people, they swing back, and a fight occurs. And, the Māori people ended up winning this fight and beating them up. And I will tell you that incident stopped right after then. And take that however you want, but when disobedience comes to mind, that story always pops up in my head.
I will add on top of that is that the Māori students were disciplined for this and not the engineering students.
They're not even the ones that started it.
It's again, Auckland Uni.
Let's take maybe, yes, right here.
I'm curious, social media, love it, hate it, it's enormously influential, right? So to what extent have the Indigenous people that you represent been able to tap into social media, either to share the knowledge systems that you talked about, Maria, to build awareness of issues that are important to you, or what's coming up in terms of regulatory policies and show up, speak up at these public hearings. Have you been successful in that?
So the question's about use of social media to advocate and to connect. Who would like to?
Do you have
Maria?
something?
Sure. As you learned already, I worked with a lot of elders, and a lot of them love social media. And they post, but for example, one of our elders here, he loves taking a lot of pictures, as you noticed, and he does like to share, his experiences and.
It's a real influencer, huh?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And during the pandemic, we had quite a few elders either connecting live with the audience, whether even showing ceremonies, or maybe they did a ceremony and they just kind of had a discussion post-ceremony and connecting with the audience, or for example, an organization that are part of the Land of Snow Leopard Network, for example, Rural Development Fund in Kyrgyzstan, who supported many elders and indigenous cultural practitioners who were the frontliners of the frontliners during COVID, who basically went out to the communities and provided, both spiritual and medical help to the communities, and that was, either kind of summarized or shown pictures that this big movement is happening. So there's definitely a lot of benefits to social media in our experience for now. As you may know, in our certain regions, quite a few social platforms will no longer be available, but that's okay. At the end of the day, as long as we're on our lands, as long as we're at our waters, we're going to be fine. In terms of kind of amplifying, and I understand how it can backfire as well, but for now I can attest it's so far it's been a pretty positive experience for our network and for our partners.
Let's take one last audience question.
Could I say one thing really quick on top of that?
Sure.
Yeah, so I just want to mention, because I think a lot of people don't realize this, like my tribe hasn't had Wi-Fi or cell service, and we only got it recently over COVID because of funding, because all the kids got sent home, and then we couldn't connect to Zoom classes, and so we disconnected all these Native kids from education, and they have to sit in front of their computers with lagging videos, not being able to hear audio in crowded households. And we were pretty much denied the right to education, where a lot of other kids were able to succeed purely based on having Wi-Fi connection. And so only recently we're getting Wi-Fi connection and cell service. And I've had people and family tried to call into hearings for the Water Board and different organizations in California, and their phone cuts out too much for the committee to hear them, and so they get cut off. So, a lot of us who are off the reservation have the right to social media, but many people who are on the reservation don't have the ability to post or even, for example, live stream when police pull you over. And this is still, the digital divide in Indian country is still very big and prevalent. So it's hard to even have that discussion about social media when so much of us are restricted from it because of how remote we are and kind of how we are overlooked by these companies.
And the recent Infrastructure Act is supposed to address some of that. Okay, last question. You're right here.
Thank you for sharing your time and your stories with us. All three of you talked about how history has disrupted your relationships with your ancestors and also with your territory somehow. So I was wondering if you were in charge of taking decision makers, those people who pretty much just go to the UN meetings and fly all over the world, or corporate leaders to your territories and share your culture with them, to move them to set more ambitious targets, where would you take them and why?
Where would you take leaders for more ambitious targets? I think it's something if we get each of you briefly before we wrap this up.
You want to go first? Okay, come back to you. I can go first. So for me, I almost would, this might be unfair, but I'd almost rephrase your question. I would rather have people who are coming from the areas I would take them to in those leadership positions instead of taking leaders and bringing them into those areas. Because I can bring them to my area in Northern California and show them the salmon kill, I can show them the redwoods, but it's very different than growing up in the culture, speaking the language which changes how you think about things, for example, the word sorry, and being able to live those experiences and have those traditional values and knowledge, such as thinking about multiple generations ahead of us, or having diversity and having youth and elder representation at the table, that they will not get from just visiting one of these places. And so that's why I really believe it needs to be Indigenous leadership at that table and not just us expressing our wants and needs to those who are already in leadership.
Maria, thoughts?
Probably to one of our ceremonies, if elders, and spiritual practitioners permit. I think what we're dealing with is a big spiritual crisis, really. And in order to restore that, well, you have to go back to your original roots. And I know, probably everybody has to honor, their ancestral lineage and cultural lineage. But I think our ceremonies are an extremely powerful way to return back to your original roots, no matter what culture or tradition you're from, but something will resonate in there.
India.
Such a hard question. I have so many thoughts. I think, first of all, I'm probably just a bit too jaded to answer this question. Where I come from is like a coastal area, and so I guess for our young people, like our young Māori and Pacific people, when I'm bringing them into where I'm from, I'll take them to the coast and show them where, we've already lost 3 houses into the ocean, or where the big fish die-offs happen in the river, or where the wildfires happen near our community and stuff like that. Where I live it's a lot of farmlands, it's orchards, it's wineries, it's all eroded and deforested, and so there are already people who benefit from the system living within my territory and living on my lands, and I don't think them seeing this happen has actually changed their mind. There are a bunch of people who live on the coast and they're wanting the government to pay millions of dollars to build a seawall to stop their houses from going into the ocean. You're like, that's going to last a handful of years. That's already gone because we've already baked in so much climate change. It didn't stop Helen Clark, who was Prime Minister before she went and helped lead parts of the UN from confiscating the entire foreshore and seabed of New Zealand from Māori in the early 2000s. And she's been all over those beaches and enjoyed those places. And so I don't know if that would necessarily fix it. I think it's more of that long-term relationship and being held accountable to those decisions and being held accountable over a long period of time, because then you can dip in and out. It's like, oh, well, what my little actions didn't impact this, or, I don't really have much to do with this, or I frankly don't care. This is the hard thing to believe, that those decision makers would even give a damn. And that's where kind of some of the civil disobedience comes in, is just forcing the hand a little bit to give a damn, basically, or removing them from power, because it's if we're having to take them somewhere to make them care, and they don't care already after decades of harm, nah, go away, better leaders. Sorry, they got real.
What an amazing group of young leaders right here. Holistic, relationship-based. Let's give them a big round.
Okay, thanks, Doug. India, Brooke, Maria, thank you for actually truly wonderful panel. And India and Maria, congratulations again on the award. During the panel, you talked about land acknowledgments, and Maria did acknowledge when she got up to receive her award that these are the lands of the Muwekma Ohlone people. And in closing, I think it's important that we all acknowledge that these are the ancestral lands that we are on right now of the Muwekma Ohlone people, that these lands are still of immense importance to the Ohlone people, and that consistent with our commitment to community, to inclusion, that we acknowledge, that we honor, and that we make visible the university's relationship with Native Americans and with indigenous populations around the world. And I've heard you really clear that it's one thing for me to get up here and say something like that, and what's really important is then what I and what all of us then do afterwards. So I take this panel as a challenge to all of us to now go home and to not only think about, but to actually take action to hopefully right prior wrongs, to use Indigenous knowledge to move forward and hopefully to work as a whole in creating a world where we've solved climate change and where we have an equitable and sustainable society. So that's what I've taken away from that. Thank you again for your absolutely fantastic work. You've certainly inspired all of us this evening. Thank you. And that's it. Come back in a year and you'll know who the 2022 award winner is.